Great. Well, thanks, Sandy. And let me first of all thank Windsor Park Collegiate, Sandy and Troy here, along with the Louis School Division for inviting us into your home here at Windsor Park Collegiate. And of course, thanks to the students for, some of you who are here voluntarily at the back in grade 9. We appreciate you being here especially. It's quite the time to be here talking about civic engagement. As all of you know, we just had a federal election a couple of days ago. And voter turnout in that particular campaign was somewhat better than it was in 2008. We know that there was, according to preliminary results, an uptick of about 3 percentage points, which means that 3 percentage points more Canadians turned out at the polls this time than they did 3 years ago. Hardly the massive influx of new voters that we thought, many of us had hoped, would turn out at the polls. And part of our job as political scientists is to make sense of this. And also part of our job is to explain why this might be concerning to a lot of Canadians. And if it were true that non-voters were identical to voters, this might not be a problem. You can imagine if the outcome of the elections not being affected, as some studies suggest it wouldn't have been, then there might not be a reason for concern. But we do know that non-voters are not like voters. We know that certain groups of Canadians are not voting at the same rate as other Canadians. As part of our U2011 series, we'll be talking about each of these groups. We know that Aboriginal peoples, we know that in some cases recent immigrants, some visible minority communities, some people with lower levels of education and lower income individuals are all less likely to vote than people who are more affluent, more part of, in many instances, more part of mainstream Canadian political society. But our discussion today talks about youth, which has been the main concern, and the media has picked up on this in this most recent campaign, trying to explain why it is that young people in Canada don't turn out to vote as much as older Canadians. And we should be clear on our terms, first of all. When we talk about young people, we're not just talking about people who are 18 or even 21. Actually, youth or young adulthood is reaching into, in some instances, your 30s. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So we talk about younger Canadians, we mean those people that are typically under 30, in some cases under 25. What do we know about these two different groups of people? What do we know about younger Canadians that makes them less likely to vote? Well, thanks to decades of research here in Canada and elsewhere, we know that in Canada, and like many other advanced industrial countries, younger Canadians tend to be less interested, they tend to be less knowledgeable, they tend to pay less attention to politics, they tend to discuss politics and elections less than older Canadians, and they tend to be approached less often by politicians, candidates during an election campaign, and strategists tend to pay less attention to them than older Canadians. So knowing this, it's quite logical that younger Canadians would not turn out at the polls as much as older Canadians. The story's not quite that simple, because we also know through recent research that young Canadians actually tend to be more efficacious, and that's a big word that essentially means they tend to feel like their vote can make a difference, they can make a difference in Canadian politics, yet they choose not to vote. Younger Canadians also tend to be more optimistic about the future of Canada, its economy, its democracy, and yet they don't turn out to vote. And young Canadians also tend to be more satisfied with the way that democracy functions in Canada, and yet they don't turn out to vote. And if we look at the flip side of that, it turns out that older Canadians, again, people over 30, in many cases these feelings increase as you get older. They tend to feel like their vote doesn't make a difference. They tend to feel less optimistic and less satisfied about Canadian democracy. So this raises a big question. How do older Canadians overcome these feelings and turn out to the polls while younger Canadians don't? I'm going to suggest to you it's because younger Canadians are embedded in a different political culture. It means they have different values, different feelings towards the voting process than older Canadians do. Now, political scientists use these terms a lot when we talk about the effect of age on turnout. We use two different effects. We call them the life cycle effect and the generational effect to help us to understand why youth turn out less in Canadian elections. The life cycle effect suggests quite simply that as young people get older, they will engage more in politics. And this is largely because older Canadians tend to have more at stake in politics. They have families. They pay taxes, pay more taxes. They pay property taxes. Politics tends to mean more to them, and politicians will speak to issues that are more important to them. One of the main issues in this particular campaign was pensions, which mean a lot to older Canadians. Yes, they mean a lot to youth as well, who may have parents or grandparents that are entering retirement age. But for the most part, politicians, the media, will focus on these issues that are important to older Canadians because they have more at stake. So as you age, you tend to have more at stake in politics, and as a result, you tend to engage more and vote more. There's also a school of thought that suggests that there's something different about this generation of youth. This is what we call the generational or cohort effect. This suggests that today's youth are less likely to vote than earlier generations of youth. Okay? And that Canadians raised in the World Wars and during the Cold War are more likely to vote when they're younger than today's group of youth. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And a fabulous new book by Paul Howe called Citizens Adrift suggests that both of these effects are at play. That today's younger Canadians feel that there's less at stake in politics, but there's something about their generation that makes them quite different from even earlier generations of youth. Now, what is this value shift that's going on? And what we find through recent research is that when we ask two questions that focus on the idea of civic duty, we find that younger Canadians conceptualize voting in a very different way than older Canadians do. So let's look at this first question. It was asked in the Canadian election study in since 2004. Simply pose the question, it is every citizen's duty to vote in federal elections. Do you agree or disagree? What we found was that younger Canadians were less likely to strongly agree with that statement. Now let's be clear. Still over half of young Canadians, people under the age, in this case under the age of 25, still over half would say that, strongly agree that it is every citizen's duty to vote. But that's far lower than we find among older Canadians. 86.4% of people over the age of 66 strongly agree that it's every citizen's duty to vote. The follow-up question I think is more interesting. If you didn't vote, would you feel guilty the next day? They asked this question in the Canadian election study, and the results again show a different set of values for today's youth compared to older Canadians. We find that for youth, 44.6% of people under the age of 25 would not feel guilty if they didn't vote following a federal election. That number is much larger. The not guilty proportion is much larger than we find among older Canadians. That number drops to about 16.3% among people who are over the age of 66. So this means that young Canadians don't feel that same sense of civic obligation or civic duty that older Canadians do. And that begs the question, why? Why is it that young Canadians don't feel that sense of civic duty? The first thing we have to note is that without this sense of civic duty, regardless of your age, you're less likely to vote. So we know that civic obligation, the sense that I have to vote, otherwise I'll feel guilty the next day, that exists among all Canadians. It just happens to exist in a larger sense for older Canadians. And this sense of duty and the sense of obligation helps a lot of older voters to overcome what we call the voter's paradox. In other words, it doesn't make a lot of rational sense for a lot of Canadians to vote, particularly if your race is not competitive. Investing the time that's necessary to learn about the candidates or even to venture to the polling station may not really be worth it if you rationally calculate it. The odds of your vote actually making a difference and swaying the election at the local level, let alone at the national level. So something's got to push Canadians to the polls, and for a lot of older Canadians, it's that sense of civic duty, which if they don't vote, they feel guilty, that's bad. And if they do vote, they have a sense of fulfillment. I did my civic duty. And younger Canadians don't feel that. Which raises a series of questions. A lot of talk in the media and in the blogosphere suggests that youth today are spoiled. They're taking their right to vote for granted, or they're simply lazy. They think they've got better things to do rather than go and venture the polls on election day. I don't buy into that. I think that today's youth are simply more democratically secure than older generations. And what do I mean by that? It means that compared to your parents or your grandparents, people under the age of 25, under the age of 30, have not had the same sense of insecurity when it comes to their right to vote that older Canadians did. Older Canadians may tell you stories, or you may hear from your parents or grandparents, eat all of the vegetables on your plate because there are starving kids in China. How many people have heard that before, right? Well, the same sets of arguments were made in the Cold War and before that in World War I and World War II go out and vote because there are people in this world, whether that be in Soviet Russia in previous times or elsewhere, that don't have the same luxury of voting that you do. Those calls to civic duty are not resonating with today's youth as much as they did with older generations. And why is that? Today's youth have grown up in an age of democratic security protected largely by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Today's youth have grown up knowing that their right to vote has been protected and secure, and it's not been threatened the way it has in earlier generations. Now, what does this mean for those of us that are concerned about youth turnout being so low? It means that we have to start moving away from talking about it's your duty to vote and trying to guilt youth into voting, because it doesn't work. And I'm starting to see some very encouraging signs on this front with a group based out of Central Canada called Apathy is Boring. You can go to their website, apathyisboring.org. And they're talking about educating youth and trying to convince them that, let's look beyond your sense of civic duty and show you there's actually a stake for you in these elections. We know that, as we'll hear in a few moments, Elections Manitoba has started shifting its focus away from civic duty necessarily and start talking about your power to choose. That's their curriculum program that we'll hear about in a couple of minutes. And it suggests that, it means something to actually participate in a decision-making process like an election. So we're starting to see that rhetoric shift. I'd also invite everybody here in the room and everybody at home watching on the webcast to visit our website, facebook.com/voteanyway, where we're encouraging youth to tell us why they think it's important to vote. And what do we mean by vote anyway? We mean vote any way you choose. We're a nonpartisan organization, right? But vote anyway, despite all of the cynicism that surrounds politics for the general population and all the cynicism that surrounds youth participation in politics in particular. Okay, so I'd encourage you to visit the Vote Anyway site. And again, thank you very much to the folks here at Windsor Park Collegiate and Louis Burrell School Division for having us. And I look forward to hearing your comments both here and online. Thanks.